WPP, one of the largest global agencies in the world, is running a divestment play. In August, they sold FGS Global to KKR for $1.7 billion. And they're not done. They've got another multi-billion-dollar divestment that they're contemplating. And we're going to talk about the what and the why on this episode of The Inorganic. Let's go. Welcome back to the Inorganic Podcast. My name's Christian Hassold. I'm your host, and this is episode 19. On this episode, we are going to dive into WPP's reported, contemplated divestment of Kantar. WPP owned 100% of Kantar since 1992. In 2019, they sold 60% to Bain. They now own 40%. That 40% is valued at around $3.2, $3.4 billion, depending on the total value of the enterprise. That's a meaningful amount of cash. And as we mentioned at the top, WPP is looking to streamline its business and run some divestment plays. And Kantar is a pretty valuable asset to be thinking about putting cash back on the balance sheet. But what is Kantar? Why would it matter to WPP in the first place? And why would it make sense to consider divesting this asset? Kantar is all about media measurement, consumer measurement, and this is an area that is becoming increasingly valuable to clients, brand manufacturers, and other customers that a media agency would have. Well, I wanted to deeply understand what exactly is going on, so I asked a good friend of mine, Keith Anderson, to come onto the pod and help us understand what is Kantar and what might be going on. Keith has an incredible background, not only at Kantar, but at Profitero, where he was leading a digital shelf measurement and insights business. And I just think he's going to do a great job of helping us get to the bottom of what's happening and the why. So Keith, before we get started, could you just tell us a little bit about your background, especially the credentials that are relevant to the discussion today?
Great to see you. Thanks so much for inviting me. Great to be with you. This potential transaction and the entire space is such a fascinating area at this moment, and I'm excited to unpack it with you.
Cool. Thank you. Maybe before we get underway with the topic at hand, I think the listeners would love to know your background and where Kantar was a part of your life and the things that you've been doing since then.
Sure. I've been in the retail and CPG services and technology space my entire career, a little over 20 years, and started actually at a boutique retail industry analysis and consulting company called MBI, which became part of Kantar and part of WPP, way back when. I think that deal was around 2003, if I remember, maybe a little bit earlier. And, was an analyst and consultant there, left there in 2008 and joined a company that shared a founder with MBI called Retail Net Group, which interestingly enough became part of Flywheel Digital, which is now part of Omnicom. And then after leaving that company, I led strategy and partnerships at Profitero, which is now part of Publicis. Spent almost a decade there and left there shortly after the Publicis deal and have been doing my own thing, advising private equity and other companies and working with retailers and brands and startups in a couple other capacities. So got to see a bit of the Kantar and WPP world from the inside and then have been active in the space ever since.
And for my listeners, just FYI, Keith is being pretty modest. He was a material player in Profitero's early origins, development of their strategy as a company, and the work that Keith did inside of Profitero, I'm quite confident added significant value to the business because one thing, sub-bullet detail for those of us who are in commerce know, getting a digital shelf analytics product into market and keeping it sticky within the customer requires that company to bring insights and benchmarking capabilities to customer, and that frequently has to be delivered with people as a part of the software. And I think Keith and his team understood that, and it's part of the reason why that business was so valuable that Publicis acquired it a couple of years back for in excess of, I think, $230 million. So no full appreciation is given to you for the role in that, Keith. And thank you for the background. So with that, let's get into kind of the who and the what here. I think the first thing would be, who is WPP for those who are not intimately familiar with WPP, and then what is Kantar? So let's start with WPP. They're a global agency with a holdco model, which is competitive with the likes of Publicis, Omnicom, or we call OMC, Dentsu, Havas, and IPG. And these large agencies over the years have adopted a pretty aggressive acquisition strategy in that they would acquire other agencies to become sort of larger global businesses. But when they acquired those agencies, their acquisition model typically was a model where they retained the keys as well as the team and put in place sort of an earn-out model that could last 5+ years. And it would incent that holdco to maintain its business and its client base and grow it to a degree in order to get the full value from the enterprise. This is kind of beautiful in terms of a cash efficient acquisition model, but it sometimes didn't always work in the favor of the global agency because those individual holdcos would frequently have conflicting interests in one another. They might compete with one another. And over the years, the CEOs of these different agencies have tried to solve that by doing more centralization and creating more collaboration in between the holdcos. But the holdcos still exist and sort of behave very independently, which is kind of been a unique challenge for them to date. And so it's no surprise that one of the things that WPP is trying to do, as some of its others are, is really streamline the business. Mark, the CEO of WPP, has been very public about his desire to create a more integrated, a more aligned WPP that can service a client through all of its capabilities with a lot of collaboration and coordination. So if you're using Group M for their holdco for media and VML is working with you on creative, there's a collaboration between the two. There's not two conflicting sort of interests trying to sell different things. That's been really hard to do. And in order to affect that, one of the things they've also been doing is divesting some of their businesses that are non-core in order to streamline. And one of the divestments that they're reportedly exploring, which we mentioned at the top of the episode, is their 40% stake in Kantar. And so what is Kantar's role in the WPP relationship? Keith, I think you can help add some color to what that is.
Sure. Well, I think it's worth understanding, sort of the fundamentals of what Kantar is. I think it's probably best known for its consumer panel businesses, notably World Panel. But Kantar is an amalgamation of a lot of historical market research banners, Millward Brown, TNS, several others. Those have all been consolidated under a brand called Kantar Insights. It also is Kantar Media, which is media measurement and analytics across channels. And, when I think of Kantar and how it's distinct and differentiated from some of its competitors, one important thing is its international footprint. It's got one of the most global international footprints. And in parts of the world, particularly Latin America, parts of Asia, I think is widely acknowledged as sort of the preferred data provider in those markets. And I think, when I look at predominantly service business models like the agency business and WPP as a holding company, they would not be the first to, through M&A or partnership, forge relationships with data companies and consulting companies for a couple strategic reasons. I think a big one that was part of the motivation for the acquisition way back when was to help them reach a more senior executive audience and build relationships upstream. Those darn executives sometimes want the counsel of somebody who isn't selling them a service directly. And so, consultants often have more senior relationships and insight about where a company's direction is headed earlier in the decision life cycle than an agency might. And so the premise was, if we have consultancy that helps us break in earlier and at a more senior level, we'll be able to attach services over time. You look at what somebody like an Accenture has done through a combination of consulting, services, and tech, and that's not a bad analogy for a sort of multi-pronged strategy. And then I think there's also been, over the last decade or two, a huge increase in demand for performance marketing. And what enables a lot of that performance is more precise and granular measurement and analytics, and building capability that deeply integrates that data and analytics into ways of working and service offerings. Companies that started in different home locations, either as a technology company primarily, or a consultancy, or a data company, almost everybody in the ecosystem has tiptoed or partnered their way into the adjacent business models because there's such an affinity between them. So I think in the context of WPP, to your earlier point, there have been varying levels of integration and consolidation over the years between different parts of the Kantar business and how deeply it's been integrated with WPP. And I think it's an important topic to touch on, because in some scenarios that integration can be viewed really favorably and it adds value. You're reducing friction, you're doing work for me that historically I might have had to do on the client side. In other cases, and I think this may become a topic as the market is evaluating deal scenarios here, is particularly with measurement, what's the value of independence and arm's length from some of the media inventory and service provision? Because, as you and I were discussing just before we hit record, I think the biggest brands and the biggest advertisers are, increasingly interested in an independent referee keeping score discreetly from trying to sell me the inventory or the services and then telling me how effective it was and, what was my reach, what was my yield, and so on.
Yeah, let's make this real for the audience. For those who are less familiar with this subject matter, let me kind of help articulate in simple terms what's going on here. In the 1950s and the 1960s, if you're going to do an advertisement for Bumblebee tuna, it was frequently an advertisement to the US consumer. You literally drop every single market, saw fundamentally the same thing, the same ad in Time Life, the same ad on television. There was not a lot of regionalization of advertising. As advertising's evolved, they've started getting a little bit more. They've deployed the ability through networks and other capabilities to say, okay, for this market, we're going to give you this message. For this market, we're going to get you this message. Fast forward to 2024, we are about getting creative advertising, be it on a billboard, in store, or on a digital footprint, to Christian Hassold, the consumer, the consumer that Christian Hassold represents as a cohort, and being able to target me specifically in a way that I can draw closer to the brand. And so if you're a media agency, you're going to tell Procter & Gamble that I can help you create the brand message for your top-of-line product, like your global creative, but I can also help stitch together the full media plan all the way from the Super Bowl advertisement that you're running down to the advertisement that you're running when I'm going to be watching the reruns of The Office on some television, look at me, I'm dated, on some streaming service somewhere, right? So then you think about, okay, I'm the agency and I want to report back to Procter & Gamble, my advertiser, about the performance of that media. Is it the agency that you want to hear from? Do you want the agency to be grading their own homework, or do you want an independent party to be grading that homework and telling you how you did in terms of reaching that audience? You probably want an independent party, because it's like the agency grading their own homework doesn't work. this is also applicable to media mix modeling, which is actually the planning of how you distribute your advertising across channels. Again, going back to where I started in the 50s, it's like, okay, I'm going to deploy advertising on ABC, CBS, and NBC. And then there's like 5 or 6 different publications, the New York Times, the LA Times, Time Life magazine. Like, it was the distribution was very simple. Now we've got 10,000 points of distribution, and they're all competing for advertiser dollars. And media mix modeling helps you decide how you're going to deploy advertising across TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all the different .com properties, Amazon out there. So you need someone, once again, who's sort of independent from the agency, because the agency has a lot of relationships, and they might say, well, we've got a really great relationship with Google, and therefore we might bend a little more deployment of advertising to one particular channel. So the measurement portion, being independent, is really important. But for an agency, it's also strategic to have that as a part of an asset in your building. But this raises the question of whether WPP has reached the conclusion that maybe they don't need to own it to be happy, or they've reached the conclusion that they want to shore up the potential. As reported in the press release, this could be about an $8 billion valued enterprise, Kantar. And if WPP has a 40% interest, that means roughly 3.2 billion US would be their share of the sale if they were to exit this. And to give you context on that, they have about 3.4 billion British pounds cash on balance sheet today. So that would essentially almost double the cash on balance sheet. We can talk about why they would want to do that a little bit later. But this be a material gain of cash to their balance sheet? I guess, Keith, there's probably one other sub-thread here that we should bring up, which is it's not just WPP thinking about divesting their interest. It's possible that Bain has their own plans for what they want to divest of Kantar. So maybe this is the right time to bring that up.
Yeah, there has been some chatter, I think, since the beginning of the year, also over the summer, that, Bain on the sell side is considering selling Kantar Media. So Kantar, as we just discussed, sort of has the insight side, which is more the sort of audience and consumer measurement. Who are people? How are they behaving? What are they buying? And the media side is, what media are they consuming? And, to Christian's good example a few minutes ago, I would say, it's notable and interesting that there's a potential transaction in parallel for Kantar Media, because Kantar Media is being positioned with support of big advertisers as a potential competitor or counterpart to some of Nielsen's media measurement, particularly in the US. Again, to Christian's point a minute ago, we're in a much more complex and high precision marketing and media landscape today than we were even a few years ago. And so there's a lot of demand for accurate, precise, independent measurement. And at the moment, I think many would argue Nielsen is effectively unchallenged. So I think what we're looking at in many ways is an unbundling of some of the assets that, over the last decade or two were bundled together with some strategic theses for why they might work well together, as we're increasingly seeing they don't always support each other as strategically under one corporate ownership as we thought. And I think it's also interesting, particularly on the Kantar Insight side and more under WPP, data and measurement, many would agree, is increasingly commodified. And maybe this is what you were previewing, Christian, but as data as a standalone asset has become more commoditized, it has become more valuable if it is infused in service or technology that is provably more effective. WPP has made some technology acquisitions historically, but I think it's hard to find, really standout success stories. And the pressure is on. WPP in Ad Age's most recent ranking remains the largest ad holding company. But, some of the players that you and I have both mentioned, Christian, particularly Publicis and Omnicom, have made acquisitions that I think have positioned them on the offense, with technology that is more aligned with the directions that, the market is headed. And to me, when I look at this potential divestiture on WPP's part, I think they're probably looking at the data side of things and saying, we don't need to own it to get the value of that data. We can continue to use it, assuming we keep the right agreements in place post-transaction. And it's going to free up a bunch of cash that will position us to potentially, regain our competitive footing with some technology acquisitions that, I think WPP likely hopes will position them more competitively, particularly in this new landscape where commerce and retail media are really rising strategically in the large brand ecosystem.
Yeah, I want to key on two things you said that are, I think, worth like a punctuation, which is anybody who's plugged into the media agency world and technology is looking at what Publicis and Omnicom have done over the last 2 to 3 years and said, WPP, what is your answer? And I think WP's answer has been, okay, we're going to build some cool things. Here's WPP Open. Here's some things we're doing in Choreograph. Assume good intent. Like, I think what they're trying to do is say, we can sort of build it and stitch it together. If I'm going to be a critic, I'm going to say, I don't see a strategy. I don't see a credible strategy for answering what is happening around you. I don't think that WPP has to be a copycat in order to be successful, but I think they have to be very intentful about what is your tech strategy in an age where you not only have to deploy media, you have to hold media accountable, and accountable in terms of the profitability and the return on investment of media, and also effectuate the ability for your customers to understand what they need to do with their creative at the meta level and the micro level in order to further engage the consumer audience. And I think Publicis and OMC have quite well figured out that making acquisitions to achieve that purpose is the right way for them to do that. And I think the cash point, like if they pursued the exit of Kantar and shorten this 3.2 billion, I would hope that one of Mark's priorities would be to earmark $1 billion of that for, we're going to do some acquisitions that are going to really make a splash in terms of our technological capabilities. I think one other thing is, like, this is probably a small diatribe, is like, what's the difference between a CTO and a chief product officer? A CTO is like, I'm going to get all the right tech and do all the right things, and we're going to have APIs, and we're going to have databases, and we're going to have Snowflake. It's a very technical answer to business problems, and they're needed and they're required in an enterprise. But it tends to be that when CTOs create product, they want to build everything. And when they build everything, what they do is they tend to not be product-led in the way they deliver solutions to their customers. A chief product officer thinks about the problem statement, about the use case from the customer backward, and says, hey, some of this technology I'm going to source, I'm going to go buy it, I'm going to go rent it, and I'm going to put it to work because we have no business building that. And some of the things that we believe need to be proprietary, we can do the building internally. And that may be a unique and proprietary data structure. I think if you over-index on trying to build things internally when you're a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, as WPP is, you run the risk of too much of the CTO side versus a chief product officer side. I don't know who inside WPP is a chief product officer. I haven't seen it. That's a question. It's not yet a criticism. Keith, one of the questions that I'd have as we kind of get to the rounding out the episode is, where would Kantar go if it were divested? Who do you kind of think would be likely acquirers? It's a very material sized asset. So there's very few people who could actually afford to buy an 8 billion enterprise value business.
Yeah, I confess, I've put some thought into where it might fit strategically. I don't have a great answer in terms of like who actually has the, dry powder to pull it off. I would say, I think it will almost certainly land with somebody who has a plan to combine it with other measurement and data assets to either build something strategic on the analytic or technology side That is, we're going to take these data assets and unlock new value by infusing them in a tech or service model that is new and different, or combining them with any of the other really notable large scale data businesses. Particularly, I think of the Circanas and Nielsen's that have competitive offerings, but largely complementary international footprints. I can see a lot of potential alignment between piecing some of those assets together. I also think that may be why Bain is looking at, potentially parsing this into pieces as opposed to, hey, we're just going to take the Kantar piece off of WPP and keep our current stake as it is otherwise.
I think the position I have is this, probably due to its size, is likely a PE play. I could see a Vista finding this asset interesting. I could see Advent, which holds other commerce assets, including Nielsen and including PackView, finding this is potentially interesting. I mean, it'd be like, well, why do you have Nielsen and them in there? But their funds, they have different funds that might do different things. So there's players there. I think HG, which is one of the largest private equity firms in Europe, I've spent some time with them. They may possibly find it interesting because if you look at Kantar, it is basically a platform. So if you have the platform, you can then attach other things to it, grow the business, and spin it out in a 4 to 5 year time period. You can either take it public or you could do something else with it. I think it's interesting that Bain is considering the divestiture of the Kantar Media portion. Some buyers might actually find Kantar Media to be valuable. So I think you have to be careful in terms of what types of spinouts you do. And the point that you raised earlier in the episode about Nielsen kind of being the only real player in the game of measurement, and Kantar Media being potentially one to challenge what has long been sort of a single player type of market. That's like, it's very interesting. So you could also make the case that divesting Kantar Media actually allows Kantar Media to become a real material competitor to Nielsen and potentially more on a global basis than it is today. So I think that would be an interesting potential outcome of the process. I think as we're kind of getting to the wrap up of the episode, a few of the interesting things that we've explored here, which is what is happening to media and measurement, how are agencies evolving? One of the things that I wonder about, Keith, is as agencies start thinking about what they have and what they're going to do differently in the future, agencies evolve in a world where collaboration intra-agency is really going to be critical to their success. The former model of holdcos operating so independently and behaving so independently without a lot of collaboration, whether you're IPG, whether you're Publicis, whether you're WPP, this can be a challenge that you could present to any one of them. How do you think they evolve their models to become more collaborative?
You can see from the outside all the consolidation that's happened within most of the major holding companies.
Yeah.
I was looking a few minutes ago at how many, individual agencies WPP had 10 years ago and how many they have now. And I've lost the stat, but it was a significant, more than 50% reduction in banners. And I think part of that is streamlining, eliminating redundant overhead so that you've just got better basic economics. But to your point, part of it is also getting more value out of the shared assets because, the old holding company model was largely the house of brand strategy. And because the agency business is so people driven and relationship driven, I think folks like Martin Sorrell had a strategy that, listen, if you don't like this one, you can work with this one. And we own both of them. So that's just fine. As the industry got more competitive, it became clear, we need to not only consolidate offices to save some money, but we need to unlock the value in that shopper marketing agency that we own and that commerce agency that is the best in the industry on Amazon with our, flagship agency of record business. And that's one thing that I think you already see that you're going to continue to see is Uh, the boutique and specialized agencies have largely been snapped up over the last few years and are increasingly being integrated with the mainstream agencies. And I think the close parallel to that is happening and will continue to happen is the technology side. 15 years ago, you would have had an agency of record. You would have had a couple boutique agencies. Even if they were under common ownership, there was no collaboration. Now there is collaboration. The next wave is your agencies are going to help you get more value out of technology that they own and they sell you, and technology potentially that you're renting from somebody else, and you don't have the internal bandwidth to use yourself. So I think that capability building is really essential to agencies' success, because as I say, a huge amount of the demand on the venture side of the industry, a lot of the investment going into commerce-oriented technology companies, the whole value proposition is you're paying an agency to do this for you on a variable rate. You can convert that into a fixed annual software contract with us that'll incidentally come in at 60% of what you're spending today and increase your throughput 30% versus what you're getting today.
Yeah.
And it'll be great. And so the agencies are having to counter that by saying, no, you can't simply, substitute a piece of software for what we do for you. They're going to have to elevate the work that they're doing, and they're going to have to build a case that they can do things with the technology, either because they own it or because they've built unique capability that you can't do yourself. And a lot of that activity, a lot of that action is happening around commerce and retail media. I think that is the single biggest shift that all of these players are grappling with, because historically they were sort of two sides of a coin that were almost never, looked at the same time. You weren't viewing retail through a media lens, and you weren't viewing media through a retail lens. And now so much advertising budget is shifting towards, the media formats that are just proximate to the point of purchase, consumption. There's huge demand for it.
Yeah. But let's talk about who's the boss here. The boss is the CMO. And the CMO's problem, we're talking about CMOs, the largest brands in the world who are making decisions to do business with these agencies, their biggest challenge is this: they just want to have one partner that they can deploy capital to for all of their needs. And what you were talking about there was commerce and retail media. It's actually a very small portion of all media spend, but it is in some ways kind of a nuisance, because it's the fastest evolving and moving with a lot of like nuanced parts. And so if you think about, we were talking about OMC's acquisition of Flywheel, like why acquire Flywheel? Flywheel was kicking butt in Amazon, and it was taking business from large agencies because they were simply better at executing retail media on Amazon search, or endemic as you'd call it, and better at the measurement portion than a global. And so OMC saw that and said, we're going to shore it up and we're going to become experts here. The answer for other agencies has not been so clear in doing that. And so what happens is that spend for media is going somewhere else. And it's kind of a headache for the CMO, because they just want to support the BU and let them get the outcome that they want. But on the other hand, they want to be able to consolidate their spend in one place, because it helps with their more global, commercial contracts. It's just easier for them to manage. So I think that's one of the underlying tensions that's happening here. We take it back to where this episode started, which is the evolution of media measurement and accountability is really evolving. And so if you're an agency playing in this market or desiring to play in this market, you have to be thinking about, how do I evolve as an agency in a world where media is changing? And how do I become product-led from a technology perspective to answer the questions my clients are asking, but also make tough decisions about where we have a right to play and where we need to let someone else grade our homework?
Yeah, well said.
So I think this is a great place to wrap up the episode. I mean, this is a topic we could probably spend another hour on because it's such a fascinating topic. But what I really hope to get out of it, I think we took away is, the importance of Kantar as an asset today and where it could possibly go, and some of the things that are happening that are bigger picture around agencies and what agencies are doing from an evolutionary perspective. So thank you so much, Keith, for joining me on this episode to explore this topic today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation, and it'll be interesting to see how all this plays out. Thanks for having me, Christian.
And to all of my listeners out there, thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Inorganic. If you enjoyed the conversation, please do like, subscribe, share with your friends. Until next time, we'll see you.